So this panel is on IT policy regulations for driving IT innovations. And I think I briefly touched upon this earlier, but let me introduce our speakers for this panel session. So the panel is going to be led by Rob Atkinson. Rob is the president of Information Technology and Innovation Foundation located in Washington, D.C. And Rob has been very active and played a very important leadership role working with the U.S. government and many governments around the world in issues related to government policies and regulations. Lenny, next to Rob, you just heard, Lenny is one of the key top note, and Lenny is also involved with various different government policy regulations, and I'm sure he can share some more details in his talk as well. Scott Belcher, he was yesterday with us, and Scott is the CEO of Transportation Society of America, and he will shed light on innovation strategies, issues, challenges, opportunity in the area of transportation, and I think transportation is a very major sector all around the world. Then we have Paul from Kaufman Foundation that we heard yesterday, very exciting talk. So we have very unique, distinguished leaders who can help us understand, articulate government policy regulations, what are the challenges, what are the issues, and how these leaders plus organizations like SRII can connect and drive some of those important areas. So with that, I will hand over to Rob.
Great.
Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris. So it's always, I think, there's this view that somehow Washington doesn't get it. And I guess it's sort of the opposite. I don't think Silicon Valley gets it. I don't think they get Washington either. So I think neither one of us gets each other. And hopefully we can try to bridge that gap a little bit today. So what I want to start off with, kind of just give some framing remarks about how the U.S. as well as other governments around the world are thinking about IT-led services innovation. So if we could have the slides, please. Okay, so that's us. We're a think tank. As Chris said, we focus on innovation policy, focus a lot on ICT-enabled innovation. And so I want to talk about today, why is there a role for government? A lot of people in industry, because you're kind of focused on your own thing, you don't really see government, you tend to think that government doesn't have much of a role to play except to give you a hard time. What are governments around the world doing, and then what are the barriers to government doing more? So I think this is actually how most firms think about where IT-based services innovation comes from. It comes from firms like that. You know, Apple didn't need the government to come out with the iPad. It just came out with the iPad. But it did need the government really to come out with the iPad because the iPad's integrally linked to the internet, and there's a whole lot of other things that are linked to that were related to government. Cisco grew out of government funding. Android really doesn't work very well unless you have a pretty high level of spectrum that's been freed up for data. So there's a whole set of issues around, I think, government. I think the better way to think about this is that we're really talking about an innovation system in which firms play an important part, but not the only part. That there's a whole set of other factors engaged in developing an effective IT-based innovation system. And to maximize IT-based innovation, I would argue you really have to get 6 things right. Pretty much everything companies do, there's an end user involved. Sometimes that's companies, but most of the time it's individuals. Individuals need to be able to be sophisticated, networked, and digitally literate. Then there's a whole set of user industries, which you all focus on, industries that aren't IT industries, but have are users. Then there's the technology itself. We need to keep getting better technologies and have those then deployed out into the various systems. Essentially what we need, since this is all IT, we need IT transport infrastructure, wireless, wired broadband. And then on top of that, I would argue we have these platforms. Now, if you think about what Scott's going to talk about with transportation, what is the transportation industry? It's not really an industry. There's an industry that paves roads. There's an industry that builds cars. It's not really an industry, it's a system. It's a system that's made up of a number of sub-industries. So we need to think about how broader systems and technology platforms like intelligent transportation system play a role in that. And then finally, the regulatory environment. So what are governments doing in each of those areas? a lot of countries, and I put these two at the top of the list, have taken leadership roles in making sure that virtually all of their citizens are digitally literate, have computers, have connections to the internet. Korea, I think, being the best country in the world on that, just had a massive set of array of policies to make sure that everybody in Korea was literate. So that's why they lead the world in the take-up of broadband. User industries. So I think this is one of the big mistakes I think a lot of people in the U.S. make, is that we shouldn't have particular policies targeted to particular industries because that would be industrial policy, which is somehow bad. But in fact, there's a lot of industries where there's a role for the government to think about how you would intervene or play a role in it. You see other countries are doing this. The Netherlands has an innovation policy, and among the sectors that they're targeting are financial services, retirement pensions, logistics, supply chain management. Denmark, you can see that, transportation, pension management, retail. Australia is now in the process of developing a new IT-led services innovation strategy. Korea and both the European Union have very interesting programs. If you look at the construction industry, it's one of the few industries we have that has had negative productivity over the last 20 years, which is really hard to do when you think about it. Each year you get less and less efficient. Now some of that may be a measurement problem, but I think some of it's probably real. And so the question is, what's going on with that industry? Why is it so lax? And should we just sort of leave it to that industry to figure out what to do? Well, we have left it that industry, and they haven't figured out what to do. So you get places like the European Union, which have launched an EU-wide initiative on construction innovation, a lot of it IT-led. And the Koreans have a very, very robust construction IT institute, and I'm not saying it's causal, but they also have the fastest, highest growing rate of productivity in any construction industry in the world. And e-government is another area, an industry, if you will, the government industry, if you will, and a lot of countries are looking at that. I just use that as an example of an industry. We did a little report last year and did some speeches for some hotel industry folks. And so one of the things we did is we went and we looked at sort of what are U.S. hotels doing in terms of innovation. And the answer is actually not very much. They're really far, far below where the production possibility frontier is. The technology they could be using in hotels is much, much less than what they're actually using. In contrast, in Finland, this is actually a new kind of hotel in Finland that was helped get along by the government. And it's a hotel where there are no people. I mean, they clean it, I guess, in the daytime, but it's basically a non-staffed hotel. You get your room key from a little, from an SMS text message. You check in, all this stuff. So it's actually a business class hotel. It's a pretty interesting idea. Technology development, how do we get technology? And again, I think the mythology out there is that technology all springs from the wings of firms acting on their own, and in fact, that's not really true. Most technology today actually comes from partnerships, many of those partnerships with government. Finland, for example, through their major technology agencies focusing on nanosensors, wireless technology, services innovation broadly. The Germans have a whole institute. They have these Fraunhofer institutes for 50, 60 or so into these institutes. And one of the things that they're focusing on is the whole issue of services engineering and management as a solely dedicated institute. And then we have a whole set of tax incentives that countries provide for doing innovation, including this kind of innovation. We just released a report last week showing that the U.S. ranks 27th among the major countries of the world in terms of R&D tax generosity. If you want to have the #1 country in the world where they will give you the best tax incentive to do R&D, you have to go to India. Has an R&D tax incentive that's essentially 6 times more generous than the American incentive. But other countries, you can see there, Spain, Portugal, France, Denmark. And then also in the last couple of years, what you've seen are countries that are actually now adapting their research and development tax credits to allow services innovation to qualify. That doesn't qualify in the United States. If you're doing services innovation, you can't use the expenditures on that to offset for a credit. But you can in Australia and Finland because they recognize the importance of services innovation. So this fourth area is platforms. And what I mean by platforms are these kinds of systems that cross individual organizations, even cross individual industries, and they're platforms that basically don't come about by themselves. So just using example of mobile payments, we have almost, I guess we're finally beginning to get mobile payments in the US, but why would you have a phone that has a near-field communications device on it when you can't use it for anything? Or in the case of health IT, why would you, this is why Google Health Vault, I think, and Microsoft went belly up, because there's no data in digital form. So why would you build a company that would provide those kinds of devices or systems for health IT when the other part of the ecosystem isn't playing? So these are essentially all chicken or egg conundrums that firms have a very hard time solving chicken or egg conundrums on their own. They eventually get solved. But I think when we see what other countries are doing, they're not happy just sitting there waiting for the market to finally figure this stuff out. You look at mobile payments, for example, the Japanese took the lead in that by basically getting their state-run railroad to put in place NFC readers for the train turnstiles, and then at the same time getting Sony and Docomo to install them on the phone. So they kind of jumped off the cliff together. Sony knew there'd be a market, and then the train company knew there'd be devices. They jumped off the cliff together, and then this thing just spread. So when you go there, you can go to Japan, you can pay with your phone in a taxi, or you can go to a 7-Eleven or all these stores. Even teachers check you in at classrooms now in Japan using your phone. They don't take roll anymore. So that's the kind of thing that is, I think, really, really important for government to help companies figure out that conundrum. And what we've seen is a country that leads the world in health IT now is Denmark. They're certainly far ahead of the United States. They're slightly ahead of some of the other Nordics. But the reason they're so far ahead, everybody will say, well, they're small. I don't think that's why. I think it's in part, it's because they've been able to do better coordination. But just the fact that they're small doesn't really mean anything. They have less money because they're small. So, but what they've done, as you can see, is they've been working on this for almost 20 years, back in '94, then '96, 2000, and they brought all the players together to essentially, as I said, jump off the cliff together. In the U.S., we're still having a very hard time being able to get that kind of coordination. Another area is the actual telecom infrastructures. You see that a number of countries have national broadband plans. The United States now does. The Obama administration launched that. It was released a couple of years ago. It was actually a very, very good plan. The only problem is we're not implementing it the way we should, but it's an excellent plan. But in terms of other countries, what we see is wireline deployment. The leading countries are Korea and Singapore that are now deploying 1 gig networks, although I really have no idea what you do with a 1 gig network. But they seem to think it's useful. Eventually we'll be able to use it, but I'm not clear for now. Japan with essentially 100 meg to almost every apartment or home in Japan. Sweden. Wireless is a little bit different. Actually, here's an area where the U.S. leads. We've deployed the digital dividend spectrum from TV before anybody else has done. We lead now in LTE deployment, but other countries are going to catch up fast, and we also have a big challenge in the U.S. to free up additional spectrum, hopefully, ideally from government users and television. And lastly, regulation. I think if you want to understand why the Europeans don't really have any IT companies, I mean, they have a few, Nokia and Siemens, a few like that, Ericsson. They don't really have any internet players very much. I would argue it's maybe not principally, but certainly partly because of the regulatory system in the European Union. The regulatory system makes it very, very hard to monetize data and put that back into the internet ecosystem. So I think that's an important part of how does the overall regulatory system affect that. So what's the U.S. doing here? In their typical way, the U.S., we don't have a plan because a plan would be telling the market what to do, so we can't do that. But we are taking actions in various components of that. The FCC recently just launched a fairly major initiative to get more people to adopt computers. By the way, one of the reasons the U.S. is lagging behind in broadband is not because we don't have good broadband, it's because we don't have people with computers. We have one of the lowest rates of computer ownership in the developed world because people either don't have the money or they don't know how to use them. So the administration's making a big push on that. We have various user industry kind of initiatives. GSA, before they ran into their problems recently, they were doing some things around building innovation. HHS obviously on health, DOE, Department of Education on educational technology, DOT, as Scott will talk about, on transportation. On technology development, NSF has a new program, the Services Enterprise Systems Program. It's a research grant program to understand the services innovation process better. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy has a new effort on big data and also on interoperable data. And as I said, we have a weak R&D credit. Platforms, you know, here and there we're doing some things. We're still struggling to get the health platform right, although we have a new guy who runs that. Seems like he's pretty aggressive. DOE and NIST working on the smart grid. Again, much, much slower than I think a lot of people thought when we did the stimulus package, how long that's taking. NIST is working on a new digital identity system that we've written about, which I think has really a lot of promise if we can get it. You go to a country like Estonia, where virtually every adult has a digital signature token certificate, where they actually vote online in national elections. That's a pretty important platform tool that then you can use in a wide variety of other things in your society. We don't really have that here. As I said, we got the spectrum incentive auctions. Regulation, I think the U.S. we have a better regulatory system, but I fear that we're essentially going down the European path. There's much more pressure on the side of saying, oh, we don't have any privacy and everybody's tracking me, and so we better stop that. The evidence is pretty clear that if we crack down on that, we will reduce revenue from ads by at least 50%. Which I think would have a huge impact on a lot of companies, particularly startup companies that are trying to get venture capital funding. All right, so lastly, and then I'll just close, what are the barriers? I think there's really, when you look around the world, there's really 4 barriers. I mean, when you think about this, there really aren't a lot of countries who are just aggressively, thoughtfully, and strategically really driving this train. And the question is why? And I think one is that there's a whole boatload of countries. I put China here because they're probably the biggest believer in this notion, but certainly Brazil, India, many other countries. They think that the way you grow your economy is to get a semiconductor factory. I'm using that as a rough example, but you know, you get those high-tech factories or that biotech factory, and that's how you get rich. What they don't want to talk about is that the way you get rich in India is you let Walmart come in and displace all the other totally inefficient small companies, or you redesign your supply chains and your logistics systems through IT. Essentially, these countries don't really embrace the notion that the way you get rich as a country is across-the-board IT-enabled innovation. They want to get the semiconductor factory. You can think I'm exaggerating, but I tell you, I've been in a lot of meetings with a lot of government officials, and this is exactly what they want to do. Brazil is exactly the same way. Second barrier, and this is more so, I think, in the United States, but certainly some other countries. That's Larry Summers, if you don't know him, who used to be head of the National Economic Council in the Obama administration. There's a view that you really kind of shouldn't be doing what we're talking about, that market really is smarter, government's kind of stupid, there's no way government can understand this, it's going to make mistakes, the market always gets it right. So there's this view that I think really holds back the U.S. It's interesting, the U.S. leads the world in essentially enterprise IT adoption. Our enterprises, individual enterprises, use more IT than any other country in the world with the exception of Sweden, and they do it better. But we lag the world on these sort of nexus between systems, these essentially these platforms. That's where we lag the world. And we lag the world because the way you fix those is you have to have public-private partnerships. The third problem, I think, and we're going to see this increasingly, we just testified in the House Judiciary Committee yesterday on cloud computing and innovation. And one of the concerns among the staffers was, isn't cloud computing going to put people out of work? Because cloud computing is a more efficient way to do computing. You're not going to need as many data centers. You're not going to need as many whatever. And aren't we going to lose jobs? And this to me is the most nefarious, misguided view that we have today in the U.S. and in most other countries. The answer is no, it's not going to lose jobs. It might lose jobs among people who run servers, but it's not going to lose jobs for the whole economy. The evidence of that is just crystal clear. You don't lose jobs from productivity. You might lose a job in one thing, but you create jobs in other places. So this, to me, is a really, really big problem that a lot of countries have succumbed to. Fourth area is resistance from industries. If you're not sort of a political economist, you tend to think that this is all just kind of happens, and companies that get their ox gored, they just kind of go by and go by the wayside and die. No, actually what they do is they spend an enormous amount of money in Washington or in Sacramento to get their position protected. But they don't call it that. They don't say, would you pass a bill to protect me? They say things like, would you pass a bill to protect consumers against this rapacious new internet startup business model? You don't really want to buy your prescription drugs. You don't really want to buy your prescription drugs on the internet. You want to buy them from a pharmacist. Or you don't really want to buy alcohol in California at a grocery store on a self-checkout thing because it leads to underage drinking, even though the California Liquor Control Board shows that it doesn't lead to underage drinking, and even though California passed the law so that you can't buy alcohol at self-checkout stores in California. So there's just enormous opposition, even in transportation. Scott will talk about it, why don't we have more ITS in the transportation bill? Because the companies who are really pushing for the bill, their business is essentially pavement, concrete, and steel. The more money goes into that, the more they get. The more money goes into ITS, the less they get of that. And then the last one really is this, again, this sort of ubiquitous thing, really rampant in Europe, but I think increasingly rampant in the US. We just as a society just don't want to go down this path. Big data. And think about that for a minute. So we have the opportunity to revolutionize the healthcare system of the world by big data. I mean, just revolutionize it. But I guarantee you in the US this will be a very, very hard fight because everybody's going to say, oh, I don't want my data, I don't want anybody to know what my health thing is, and it certainly isn't going to be anonymous, and it certainly won't be secure, so we better not do that. Even though you can build anonymous and secure big data systems that mine data to get the kind of results you need to be able to improve healthcare. So I think this is a really, really big barrier. So I will just close by saying, you should read our book. That's what I'll close by. Lenny read it, so that's our new book coming out. But I'll just close by saying, I think if you're in the business of where you're developing technologies, you really need to understand this isn't just a thing of the better mousetrap wins. There's a lot of cases where the better mousetrap doesn't win. Sometimes it's the case where the deeper wallet wins. And that's why it's really important, I think, for you all to get engaged in these and get your voice out there, how critically important this kind of innovation is. So thank you. And I guess we'll go to Lenny. How are we doing?
Okay, well, I'm Scott Belcher. I'm the president of ITS, the Intelligent Transportation Society of America. And we're an organization that's much like SRII. We're focused on the use of technology to solve transportation problems. We've got state chapters, so I was fascinated in your conversation yesterday, many of the same issues we are. We're also an international organization. We're the Secretariat for the Americas. There's a European sister and an Asian sister as well. And our makeup is essentially 50% public sector, 50% private sector. So I'm going to dive a little bit more deeply into one particular sector, which is transportation, because that's where I focus and that's where I'm most interested in. And we had a big week, a big month last month, or this month. We actually passed a transportation bill, and that was after 10 extensions in 3 years. We didn't pass a long-term extension bill. It's a 2-year bill, 27-month bill. We didn't pass a bill that would have done all the things that Rob and the panel he served on, and the many other multiple panels in Washington that have looked at this that would have really transformed transportation. We made some incremental changes that we'll see over the next 27 months. But we didn't really address the biggest issues. The biggest issue really being financing, and how do we pay for our transportation system, and how do we keep it from continuing to decline, because it is rapidly becoming a second-class transportation system. But we are politically incapable of addressing those problems right now, and so we'll take what we can get. And quite frankly, we're such a cynical place in Washington right now. We're all cheering for a 2-year bill because that was a whole lot better than the alternative. The bill does have some innovation in it and does have some things that I think will drive innovation and will create opportunities for the companies and individuals represented here. And I'm going to just touch on just a couple of the ones that I see as opportunistic. The first thing is that the bill, and this is an innovation that the panel Rob had worked on, and again, a number of other bipartisan panels, had really pushed to make transportation a performance-based system. And that means a system in which you actually have baselines, and then you measure against those baselines. And then, you know, if we were really bold, then you'd reward folks who achieved their targets, and you'd punish those who didn't. But we're not that bold, but at least we made the first step. And the first step is to talk about performance management. From a technology standpoint, that's really important, because right now we don't have data, we don't have baseline data. And you can't measure performance if you don't have baseline data. And if you're going to measure performance, you're going to measure it based on the backbone of technology. So there will be innovation there. And I think the innovation, I mean, first, that's huge. It seems for you all, seems like it should be a no-brainer, but it really isn't. And so that first move is important. But I really see the states, so let me take one step back. We haven't, we're continuing to underfund our system. This bill it will fund the transportation system at the same level. So states, their purchasing power has declined dramatically. We haven't raised the gas tax since 1994. So what's happening is, as the transportation funds shrink, state funds shrink, the state's ability to invest in transportation shrinks. And so what do states do? Some thoughtful, creative ones look to technology. Most don't. I think as we continue to see shrinking budgets, you're going to see more and more state and local governments looking to technology. The other thing that's going to happen is they're going to look to two sources for technology. They're going to look to the big companies, the IBMs, the Ciscos, the Verizons, that are now coming into the market because they have big systems that can manage big data. And big data is really part of the future of transportation management. But they're also going to be looking to the startup companies. There are so many companies out there right now that are offering new and innovative and cheap alternatives to addressing the problems we face, that I think you're going to see DOTs, and you are seeing DOTs, really looking to these innovative companies and startup companies for ways to address their immediate problems. So instead of going to a typical A&E consulting firm who does have deep pockets and does invest heavily in Washington in protecting their interests, you are starting to see places like Boston, for example, totally opening up its entire data set to entrepreneurs to try to solve its traveler information problems. I mean, unheard of recently. So I think that's going to create opportunities. I think there will be opportunities. What we've done is we've shrunk about 140 programs at the US DOT down to about 60. And so we've eliminated over 60 programs. I don't know how much innovation that drives. It may drive more bureaucracy for all I know. I mean, we're always reorganizing things in Washington, but the bureaucracy had gotten out of control. And so it is possible that we'll see some synergies and some opportunities. Streamlining project approvals. Again, the faster we can, one of the things that is, one of the things Rob didn't mention in his discussion about the problems with Washington that you all should appreciate is the time that it takes to accomplish anything. So if you think about the time that it took to build and take Facebook to public, roughly 5 years, from 0 users to, I heard, 800 million users, $0 to $1 billion. You think about how long it takes the automotive industry to institute change and then to flip the vehicles on the road. 18 years. We've got a disconnect between the speed at which innovation happens and the speed in which transportation change happens. So anything we can do to speed that up. Another new thing that came out in this bill is a $60 million a year program for technology and innovation deployment. We're really excited about that because we think that we can use that to push states to adopt to adopt new programs, to adopt new technology, and to reach out to new companies. There are opportunities to promote efficient management and operations. Again, that doesn't seem like much, but for us it's huge. One big opportunity is we have what's called the TIFIA loan program, which is about $140 million a year program. That got plussed up to almost $1 billion. It's $750 million in 2013, $1 billion in 2014. So this is for big transportation programs, or big transportation investments. Now the government has increased the amount that it will match from 30% to 50%, and ITS technology projects are included in it as long as they're, and they can be bundled, but the bundling has got to be at least $15 million. So this is an opportunity, and the government, the US DOT and Congress think that for every dollar that they invest in this loan guarantee program, they can expand it by 10. There's a 10-to-1 performance there, or 10-to-1 expansion. So that's huge. And then finally, the other thing that we were really very happy about is we've got technology deployed throughout. There are a couple of other interesting initiatives pushing innovation. The biggest one right now, and this is kind of a good picture, bad picture, is the US government is promoting what they call a connected vehicle program. These are vehicles that talk to each other, okay? ITS America was successful in having some of that precious spectrum set aside for this program. The US DOT has concluded that if this program's deployed, it can reduce the number of impaired crash scenarios by over 80%. So that's the same as seat belts, electronic stability control, airbags. So it's huge. It will create an entirely new market, an entirely new transportation system. The problem is that the government's doing it. So instead of coming to your companies that know how to deal with security issues, cybersecurity issues, privacy issues, they're trying to work it out themselves. But it is a very important new program. It will provide very many new opportunities for innovation. And when I said it was a bad story too, is they've invested in a technology, which is always a bad thing to do. They've invested in what's called 5.9 gigahertz spectrum, which by the moment they did that, they were obsolete. Because now everybody says, well, LTE will be able to take care of it. But that's not the point. If they hadn't made an investment, and sometimes governments do have to make investments, they do have to put a stake in the ground to make that change and to allow that to happen. I see my time is about up. Let me just mention one other important initiative that you all ought to be paying attention to, and this is not coming out of DOT, but it's coming out of the White House. And that is their Open Government Initiative. This administration has really been trying to push data out there and make all the government available data publicly available. And this is where you're starting to see some real changes. At the city level, for example, progressive cities are making their transit data, they're making their transportation data available in real time. And what that's doing is it's creating innovation. It's creating new companies that are taking that data, mashing it up with other data, and creating apps that people use. So it's a whole lot better to know when your bus is actually going to arrive at the bus station than when the schedule says it's going to arrive at the bus station. Think about how efficient you are. It's a whole lot better to be able to take the Garmin or the traveler information system that you use in your car and then overlay crowdsourcing and overlay gamification on top of that so that you're getting not only the best transportation data, but you're getting real-time data. And so as the government tries to push this data out there, it's going to try to create new innovation. The last thing, and I'm going to end here, I think Rob probably did a sufficiently good job on gloom and doom because of what our government's not doing, and I agree with pretty much everything he said. I do see that where I see the change happening, though, especially in transportation, it is happening. The private sector is driving it. It can't drive all of it, but we are seeing that we're seeing that the private sector pulling the government along. We saw that in the spectrum debate. You know, as different consumers who needed different parts of spectrum really shaped that discussion. So I think you're well positioned, and I'll stop there.
Should I use this one or this one? You got it. Hi, I'm Paul Kedrosky. I'm with the Kauffman Foundation. I think I ran into or met a bunch of you yesterday when I spoke. So thanks again, Chris, for having me and or the foundation back. So I'll just make some quick comments with no slides. You know, in general, as a 501c3 organization, the foundation, we're not allowed to lobby, so we don't actually have a political view about anything. So all of this is more in the form of suggestions than anything else whenever we're talking to governments. So the way, we've got about 5 or 6 things that we spend a lot of time thinking about and that we really think are important from the standpoint of policy. And I'll just run through a couple of them. One of our favorite issues, and you know, I've been involved in this, spent part of my time as a venture capitalist, so I'm signatory to something called the Startup Visa Program, and Kauffman Foundation has also been involved in this indirectly. And this is this idea, and there's some excellent data supporting it from Vivek Wadhwa and others, that close to half of the Silicon Valley startups now have either an immigrant founder, co-founder, or senior staff member in the first 5 employees, which is a pretty remarkable statistic, right? That so many companies in one of the sort of the hottest entrepreneurial hubs in the US and therefore in the world has such a dependence on immigrants. So one of the things that we've been pushing, we push in the form of the Startup Visa Program, but even just more broadly, is this idea of making it easier than ever and as easy as we can to allow that process to not just continue but to accelerate, because this country has a tendency to now and then forget its own origins and start to talk about as if it's going to sort of close the borders and make it more difficult for people to come here and create companies and create wealth, create jobs. And so, you know, we've suggested things like, for example, that all graduate level degrees in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics granted in the US at a higher education level should come with a work visa stapled to it, as an example, that it's a way of letting people stay here legally without having to raise money, without having to buy their way into a visa program, or without having to be sponsored in the form of an H-1B and then be stuck there for whatever period. Literally let them go out and create jobs in the form of having a visa stapled to a science, technology, engineering, or mathematics degree. And there's a lot of other things going on in this front, but I throw it out as one example. So it's a data-driven idea, this notion that we are heavily dependent, and this is true around the world. It's not unique to the United States. So this is something that has nothing to do specifically with anything here. It's something that can happen anywhere, that we're all dependent on fresh blood to drive innovative thinking and fresh thinking. So why not institute that, institutionalize that, make it easier for immigrants to start companies within your country. Chile is doing some interesting things in that regard. So this idea of making, pushing back hard on the idea of how enforceable non-compete agreements are is really important to us. One of the other things we spend a lot of time looking at is the doing business studies. So what this again applies around the world, looking at some of the indices with respect to the ease of company creation, the ease of company exiting. One of the more bizarre measures that I think is turning out to be incredibly important, in particular outside the US, is how easy is it to kill a startup? I hear this all the time from entrepreneurs around the world, that one of the problems they have is that once they create some legal obligations in the form of having created a company, that those obligations often live on long after the company is formally dead. And that's a huge problem. I mean, I don't have, let alone having the resources to deal with those obligations when the company existed. If I have contingent liability long after the company ceases to exist or even be financially viable, that's a risk that I have to factor into my decision with respect to going out and acting more entrepreneurially. So a number of these indices, and the doing business indices are fairly useful in this regard, are really important to us as we sort of look around, not just around the United States and compare individual states, but look around the world and comparing countries with respect to some of the major factors. And these aren't things like venture capital. These are some of the more pragmatic things that entrepreneurs worry about, largely having to do with ease of company creation. The complexity of company creation is the stack of paper I have to do this big or this big. These are the sorts of mundane but practical things that actually matter in the real world of real entrepreneurs. Having mentioned venture capital briefly, I'll just say that one of the things we try to dissuade governments around the world from fixating on is venture capital, not because it's somehow unimportant. It's incredibly important, but it's incredibly important to a small list of companies at a particular point in their lifetime. It's no panacea. It doesn't come first. It's a service function to entrepreneurs, much like law or accounting. or other professional services firms, it's not the precedent. It's not the thing that leads you into having more entrepreneurs. So often, as we travel around, we hear people talking about we want to create a more entrepreneurial culture in country XYZ, and they say, so here's what we're doing. We've created a pool of venture capital, and we've invited people in to make proposals to us where they want to create domestic venture capital funds. And my response, and our Kaufman response, is always, that's lovely, but what does that have to do with entrepreneurs? I see how that's great for, sort of wonderful folks in dark blue suits with firm handshakes. I'm sure they're delighted at the news that you've created a pool of capital that they can share in and draw management fees from. But the reality is, even in the United States, if you look at, say, Inc. 500 data, less than 15% of the fastest growing companies in America ever raise venture capital money. So even among the fastest growing companies, if you look more broadly across the entire economy, it's less than 0.5% of all startups ever raise venture capital. And that's not because they can't. Many of them could. They choose not to, or they're in other sectors where it's irrelevant. But it's really important, as you think across your entire country's economy, not to fixate on some of the more obvious things that feel like you can do. It's so easy to raise a pool of money and then go out and offer it out to venture capital. It's much harder to have a bunch of noisy, bratty, obstreperous entrepreneurs come in and tell you how everything you're doing is screwed up and how they're going to fix it. Those people are really aggravating. I'd much prefer to have the firm handshake, blue-suited VCs come in, because that's not quite as aggravating as having entrepreneurs come in and tell me that everything I'm doing is wrong. So we really drive hard on that. Patents. Patents are, we argue, maybe a correlate at best. There's this temptation to fixate on patent intensity and patent production within countries. We think it's the wrong place to focus. Generally speaking, patent intensity is a reflection of a lot of other things that are going on, but it's not particularly important in some of the fastest growing sectors within the entrepreneurial economy, certainly not in software. And in many ways in the United States, we've kind of stepped in the wrong direction with respect to business method patents and software process related patents that are causing all kinds of hold-up issues now that we wish would go away, but we started the problem more than a decade ago. 2 or 3 other quick areas. One is in healthcare. There's this mythology again that the people we should be most interested in are the 22-year-old engineer from Stanford who's starting a company in their garage. The reality of of startup creation in the United States is a median age is closer to 40 years old. And one of the biggest issues that those people have is not the availability of venture capital or even the stack of paper that they have to fill out to become entrepreneurs. One of the biggest issues they have is healthcare. If I leave this job and I go start a company and I get sick, I'm bankrupt, right? That's historically been one of the biggest concerns that middle-aged people in the United States have as they go out, because they feel like it's a risk I can't take. When you're under 25 years old, you don't have that problem because you're immortal, right? You're never going to die. Everything's going to be fine. I can create companies all day long, and even if I get sick, I'll instantly get better, everything will be fine. Not the case for others. And so one of the things we push very hard on within the United States, but also around the world, is this idea of realizing there's a direct connection between the ease with which people can make the transition out of companies to start their own company and whatever fear they feel with respect to the likelihood of getting sick and the consequences that has for their own personal finances. It's incredibly important, especially with entrepreneurs who are, post age 25 and therefore no longer immortal. 2 more real quick ones. One is in universities. Universities are obviously wildly important, but generally speaking, we screw it up in terms of how we go around the world telling people what they should do. There's a tendency to walk around and explain the Stanford model or the MIT model with respect to the how Google came out of Stanford, or how the entire sort of networking culture came out of the Boston and MIT. And the reality is that most of what's interesting in terms of technology flow out of universities happens inside of the heads of graduate students, right? It's not, generally speaking, in the form of licenses, technology commercialization, technology transfer offices. It's generally speaking in the form of people, graduate students who are hungry, going out the door and saying, I need to do something, because God knows this crazy faculty position thing may never work out. I may never get a job. I'm going to have to do other things. And so they go out and they do other things. And then again, that expertise goes out the door with them. And then ex post, they often end up licensing technology that they took out with them when they went out in the process of creating a company. We see that over and over and over again. And we hear sort of, behind closed doors at even the largest universities that people even recognize this happens and tacitly encourage it to some degree. The notion that you can front end the process and sit there and say, here's the hot piece of technology we're going to really focus on and license. We're going to get out there and we're going to create the next Google. I had this conversation inside the UC system in the chancellor's office not long ago, where I said, if you think about yourself in this grand spectrum, at one end you're kind of the blue-smocked Walmart of intellectual property, And at the other end, you're Google hunters. This is the spectrum in terms of how you think about IP. Where do you put yourselves? And I thought the answer was obvious, right? And they said, well, we're looking for the next big thing. We're looking for the, this sort of Google IP. And I said, okay, I have a suggestion for you. I said, you should quit this university gig, go out and raise a fund and make yourself some real money, because if you can do that, that's one of the hardest things in the world, and you shouldn't be messing around inside of a university. Go out and get rich. And of course, at that point, the meeting sort of descended into anarchy, and everyone was really unhappy with me. But the point is that as a university, what should you be focused on? You should be focusing on the broadest licensing policies possible, making them as standard and as cheap and Walmart-ish as you can, so there is no obstacle to getting IP out the door. It just flows out the door, and don't pay a cent events, Walmart style, as frequently and as quickly as possible, with no front-end nonsense going on inside of TTOs and others. And that's the real lesson of how to get technology out of universities. The last point I'll make, and this sort of covers all of the things that I've talked about, is, and this is incredibly important as you think about it from a policy standpoint, is every time you're thinking about one of these areas as possible levers for driving more innovation in country, ask yourself, how will you know if it worked? How will you know if it worked? Because it's too easy as government to come out with all kinds of policies and programs and never really have an upfront way of allowing yourself and allowing your stakeholders to say, that worked. You don't get to say after the fact, move the goalposts and say, well, we knew this was going to happen anyways, and so this is the way we know this worked. No, say up front, how will we know if this program worked? Are you going to create more jobs, more companies? Are you going to have a new cadre of entrepreneurs? Is GDP going to rise? Something. Come up with something so you can stand and you can hang a hat on and say, this is the way we're going to know whether or not this program works. So how will we know if this program worked is one of the most important questions government and policymakers can ask themselves, and they so rarely do. And it's obviously twinned with the question, and when will we know? So, thank you.
Thank you.
So I recognize that we're running late and we're the only people standing between you and lunch. So I'm going to be brief. You saw my slides before, so I'm going to very quickly make a recommendation, suggest 4 arenas of opportunity and innovation that I'd encourage you to watch, suggest an experiment that I think we ought to try a lot more, and then conclude with a plea. And I will apologize in the beginning, this is more US-centric, but let me start with that. My recommendation is make sure you read Rob's book when it comes out. If you don't have a sense of the importance of innovation policy, its relevance for competitiveness, what really works, what are global best practices, and why no one's actually doing this very well, you got to read Rob's book and encourage everyone that's in a policy-making vein to actually do that. And it'll be out next month, and so we'll host them. So, that's great. Seriously, I had a chance to read it last weekend, and it's terrific. The 4 areas that I would encourage you to watch and engage in, and these I think are consistent with the comments I made earlier around where we need innovation and where there's opportunity, but I also think they are ripe and there will be very interesting business opportunities. The first one is that I think we need to think of U.S. higher education as a strategically important export business. It already is today. When students come to this country, that's an export because they're from the country. When they stay and produce new innovations and build new companies, it's even better. But the problem is we haven't really reinvented that delivery model in 200 years. Well, guess what? There's an enormous innovation that is already underway in that arena that's going to dramatically alter the cost and productivity of how higher education is delivered. So watch this space, look closely at things like what is happening at Stanford and Coursera, and they're thinking about the scaling of opportunities to massively deliver education online. Look at what in a large public university, Arizona State is doing to reimagine what a university and a public university looks like. Look at where a lot of the venture capital is going in ed tech and things like Minerva, which was the largest first stage funding in a higher education arena last year or earlier this year. And even look at things like Western Governors University, which is the largest online not-for-profit university that delivers a fully online education experience, including a personal mentor and free textbooks for $6,000 a year, and the average person graduates in 3 years. And they do that and make $500 a year. So I think thinking about higher education as a large, innovation-ripe, export, strategically important industry is the first thing that I would encourage. I also think that's going to come to K-12 as well, but given the distributed governance and the labor issues in K-12, I think higher ed will lead. higher education. The second one I would do is take a hard look at the opportunity to bring payment-oriented innovation to the healthcare industry. So I think we have, through the Affordable Care Act, are on our way to rapidly expanded coverage that we will not be able to afford unless we bend the cost curve. We're not going to do that until people are incented for outcomes rather than inputs. And there are a lot of experiments going on at a smaller level and some at a larger level, including the state of Arkansas, which is turning its Medicaid system over the course of the next couple of years from fee-for-service for paying for episodes. And the opportunity to actually have people get paid for what works as opposed to providing more inputs is going to be essential to change the cost structure of healthcare. So that's one I'd look at. The third one is, despite the reauthorization of the transportation bill, there's no way that the government's going to be able to afford, the way we're financed today, the amount of infrastructure that's going to need to be built over the next decade. And I think there is going to be an enormous need and opportunity for new kinds of infrastructure financing, much of it happening on a state or local level, that brings private investment and brings all of this capital that's sitting on companies' balance sheets and in funds to bear to reinvest in our infrastructure. It's particularly true in a time frame where we need long-lived liabilities to be associated with helping fund all of the pension obligations we've got. So it's an institutional innovation that will need to happen. I'd love to see some of it happen at the federal level, but I'll come for a moment, but I'm skeptical that that's going to happen. So I'd look for things like what Rahm Emanuel's trying in Chicago. We'll see if it works, but there will be other places in cities, counties, and states that bring private sector capital to bear. That's important because it funds it, but it's important, even more importantly, because it will help bring the competitive pressure that will help turn the construction industry from being a drag on productivity to one that actually innovates and delivers better. So that's the third one, public-private finance and infrastructure. And the fourth one is, and this is partly underway, but I think we're only at the cusp of it, is what is possible with open government. I believe that the vast amount of opportunity that's going to come from improving the delivery of government services isn't going to come from the government. It's going to come from opening up the data architectures and letting the private sector innovate on top of it, both because it will create new opportunities, but the transparency and performance that comes with it being open will help ensure that those innovations do happen. As a very simple example, the amount of fraud and misuse of funds in the Medicare system is just enormous. If we just had all that information broadly available and had people incented to try and find that, we might be able to take a big slice out of our cost structure. So opening up government data much more quickly. So those are the four arenas that I'd be watching for. Higher education is a strategic export industry, technologically enabled. Healthcare moving to paying for outcomes. Transportation and infrastructure funded in partly by private innovation, and then open government. The experiment that I'd like to see a lot more of, and is that part of the reason why a lot of these things aren't happening and policy is not encouraging the kind of innovation that we'd like to see, is not just because not everyone's read Rob's book yet. There is an element of it which people don't really understand, the concept in a lot of policy arenas. But it's also that, for better or worse, aging democracies around the world are not working very well. They're not solving the more fundamental issues that have to do with how do we invest for the next stage, how do we deal with the kind of support that will enable this kind of innovation. And I think what we need is to take the gun out of the hands of our elected officials and move more things back into commissions and representatives that enable thoughtful, deliberated, integrated solutions to be put forward. When you have in the US Congress no overlap in the political ideology of the parties, and you have to have 60 votes in the Senate to pass anything, nothing's going to happen. So I'd like to see, Larry Lessig had an editorial and testimony in Congress last week, an editorial and blog in The Atlantic on the opportunity for large-scale citizen deliberations and commissions to be a part of a decision-making process. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. So that's the idea. My final thing as a plea is the policy topics that we've been talking about are too important to be left in the hands of people that we elect. And so the kinds of changes that we're talking about are only going to happen if those of us who have interest in making them happen engage. We can't keep the 3,000-mile distance between Silicon Valley and Washington at that distance. We really have to engage in these topics and hold our elected officials accountable for these topics and ensure that the things that we're talking about actually happen. So my plea is, don't just make this an intellectual exercise. Engage yourself, engage your institutions, and ensure that the things that we're talking about actually happen.
Great, thank you.